Hello everyone and welcome to Dr. Shuchi, the anthropologist. In this video, we will explore the major theoretical perspectives of social cultural anthropology.
Over time, social-cultural anthropology has developed diverse theoretical traditions that explain how cultures originate, function, and change. These frameworks provide conceptual lenses from evolutionism to contemporary approaches, guiding how anthropologists interpret human societies.
Classical evolutionism developed mainly during the 1870s to 1910s and was the earliest major school of social cultural anthropology. Thinkers such as E.B. Tylor and L.H. Morgan proposed that societies passed through three stages: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. This became known as unilinear cultural evolution.
The next major perspective is diffusionism, which developed between the 1890s and 1930s. Unlike evolutionism, it argued that cultures do not develop independently. Cultural traits spread through migration, trade, contact, and borrowing. Diffusionism mainly includes the German, Austrian, British, and American, or neo-diffusionist schools. The German-Austrian school, also called the Kulturkreis, or Culture Circle School, was associated with Fritz Graebner and Wilhelm Schmidt. They believed that cultural traits originated in a limited number of culture circles and later spread to other societies. They particularly tried to identify the original source, or origin, of cultural traits. The British school of diffusionism was represented mainly by Grafton Elliot Smith and William James Perry. They proposed the Heliolithic theory, according to which ancient Egypt was a major center of civilization. They believed that important cultural traits spread from Egypt to other regions through migration, trade, and cultural contact. The American school, or neo-diffusionism, included scholars as Franz Boas, Clark Whistler, and A. L. Kroeber. Unlike the British school, they rejected the idea of a single center of cultural origin. They emphasized fieldwork, culture areas, and trait-by-trait analysis to understand the distribution of cultural traits.
Historical particularism, also called Bayesian anthropology, developed mainly during the 1900s to 1940s. Franz Boas argued that every culture has its own unique history. Therefore, each culture must be understood within its particular historical and environmental context. He emphasized cultural relativism, intensive fieldwork, and scientific ethnography, rather than making broad evolutionary generalizations. Boas focused on understanding each culture in its own historical context.
The next major perspective is functionalism. It developed mainly during the early 20th century. Functionalists argued that social institutions perform important functions for individuals and for society. These functions help maintain social stability, social cohesion, and continuity. Over time, functionalism developed in different directions. These included psychological functionalism, structural functionalism, studies of social organization and social roles, and later extensions of functionalist thought. Psychological functionalism, also known as individual functionalism, was developed by Bronislaw Malinowski. Based on his extensive fieldwork among the Trobriand Islanders, he argued that social institutions exist to satisfy basic biological and psychological needs. Institutions such as family, religion, economy, and kinship continue because they perform important functions in meeting human needs. In simple terms, Malinowski viewed culture and social institutions as practical mechanisms that help people satisfy their needs and maintain everyday social life. Structural functionalism was developed by A. R. Radcliffe Brown. Unlike Malinowski, who focused mainly on individual needs, Radcliffe Brown placed greater emphasis on social structure. He argued that social institutions, such as family, religion, law, and education, are closely interconnected. These institutions work together to maintain social order, social stability, and continuity. In this way, Radcliffe Brown viewed society as an integrated system, where different institutions perform complementary functions and contribute to the maintenance of the social structure. Raymond Firth made an important contribution through his study of social organization. He emphasized the close interrelationship between economic and social organization, kinship, authority, status, and social roles. Firth also highlighted the importance of individual action and choice within social structures. His work helped anthropology move toward processualism and transactionalism. These approaches focus on action, choice, social interaction, and social change. In this way, Firth helped shift attention from society as a fixed structure toward the ways in which people actively create, negotiate, and change their social relationships. Role theory, associated with Siegfried Friedrich Nadel, explains social structure through the concepts of status and role. Individuals occupy different social statuses, and each status is associated with specific roles and responsibilities. Nadel emphasized that when individuals perform their roles, they contribute to the functioning of society. In this way, the performance of social roles helps maintain social order, stability, and continuity within society. The extension of structural functionalism is associated with Mayer Fortes and E. Evans Pritchard. They further examined social structure, kinship, political organization, and social institutions. Their studies showed that institutions do not operate in isolation. Instead, they function within wider systems of social relationships. These interconnected relationships and institutions help maintain social order and ensure social continuity within society.
Neoevolutionism emerged mainly during the 1940s to the 1960s as a response to classical evolutionism. Unlike classical evolutionists, neo-evolutionists did not assume that all societies follow a single evolutionary path. Instead, they emphasized multilinear evolution, ecological adaptation, and the role of technology in social change. They argued that different societies may develop in different ways, depending on their environmental conditions, their cultural context, and their technological development. In simple terms, there is no single path of evolution followed by all societies. Universal evolution was proposed by Leslie Alvan White. White argued that cultural development depends largely on a society's ability to capture and utilize energy. He emphasized the central role of technology in this process. As technology improves, societies become capable of harnessing and utilizing greater amounts of energy. According to White, this increased energy use leads to greater cultural development. Thus, technology and energy become major driving forces of cultural evolution. Multilinear evolution, associated with Julian Haynes Stewart, rejected the idea that all cultures follow a single, universal path of evolution. Stewart argued that different societies develop along different evolutionary pathways. These pathways are shaped largely by their environment, their available resources, and the ways in which people adapt to them. He therefore emphasized the relationship between culture and ecology. According to Stewart, culture develops as an adaptation to particular environmental conditions. In simple terms, different environments create different challenges, and societies develop different cultural solutions to respond to those challenges.
The next major perspective is cultural ecology and materialist approaches. It developed mainly between the 1950s and the 1980s. This perspective emphasizes the importance of environmental and material conditions in shaping culture, economy, and social organization. It focuses on how people adapt to their environment, use available resources, and organize their social life under particular material conditions. This perspective mainly includes two important approaches: cultural ecology and cultural materialism. Cultural ecology, developed by Julian Stewart, explains culture as an adaptation to the environment. Stewart argued that ecological conditions influence important aspects of human life, such as subsistence, technology, settlement patterns, and social organization. Therefore, different environments can produce different cultural forms. For Stewart, culture cannot be understood separately from ecology. To understand cultural change, we must examine how people adapt to their ecological surroundings, use available resources, and respond to environmental conditions. Cultural materialism, developed by Marvin Harris, gives primary importance to material conditions. Harris argued that factors such as technology, economy, environment, and subsistence strongly influence cultural patterns. According to this approach, even beliefs, values, and ideologies are largely shaped by underlying material conditions. In other words, the way people produce, obtain, and use resources plays an important role in shaping their culture. Thus, material life becomes central to explaining cultural differences and patterns of cultural change.
Structuralism, developed by Claude Lévi-Strauss, argues that cultures are shaped by underlying structures of the human mind. According to Lévi-Strauss, these structures are reflected in patterns of thought, especially through binary oppositions. For example, nature and culture, raw and cooked, life and death, or male and female. Lévi-Strauss studied myths, kinship systems, and systems of classification to identify these deeper patterns. In this way, structuralism seeks to understand the unconscious structures of human thought that organize cultural beliefs, relationships, and meanings.
Post-structuralism is associated with thinkers such as Michel Foucault and Pierre Bourdieu. It challenges the idea that meaning and social reality are fixed or universal. Instead, it emphasizes the close relationship between knowledge, power, and discourse. According to this perspective, power does not operate only through force. It also influences what societies accept as knowledge, what they define as truth, what they consider normal behavior, and even how they understand social reality. In simple terms, knowledge and power are closely connected. What a society accepts as true or normal can be shaped by social institutions, dominant discourses, and relations of power.
Symbolic and interpretive anthropology, developed mainly during the 1960s to the 1980s. This perspective views culture as a system of symbols and meanings through which people understand and interpret their world, rather than focusing primarily on biology or environment. It asks a different question: what do cultural practices mean to the people who perform them? It therefore examines the meanings people attach to beliefs, rituals, symbols, and everyday practices. In simple terms, culture is not just about what people do. It is also about what those actions mean to them. Symbolic anthropology, associated with Victor Turner, emphasizes the importance of symbols, especially in rituals. Turner paid particular attention to rites of passage, the rituals that mark important transitions in a person's life. He introduced the concept of liminality, the transitional stage between one social status and another. During this stage, normal social distinctions may temporarily weaken. This can create communitas, a strong sense of equality, unity, and shared identity. According to Turner, communitas can strengthen social bonds and relationships within a community. Interpretive anthropology, developed prominently by Clifford Geertz, views culture as a web of significance created by people themselves. According to Geertz, culture is not simply a collection of behaviors. It is a system of meanings through which people understand and interpret their world. Anthropology, therefore, seeks to interpret these meanings through a method known as thick description. Thick description goes beyond simply describing what people do. It examines the cultural context in which people act, create meanings, and understand their everyday experiences. In simple terms, anthropologists do not only ask, what is happening? They also ask, what does it mean?
The Marxist, political economy, and conflict approaches emerged prominently from the 1960s onwards. These approaches examine how society is shaped by class relations, economic inequality, power, and the control of resources. They argue that culture and social life cannot be understood separately from economic interests and power relations. A key focus is on the unequal distribution of wealth, resources, and political power, and how these inequalities influence social relationships and social change. The major branches include Marxist anthropology, conflict theory, and world systems or dependency theory. Marxist anthropology, based on the ideas of Karl Marx, and further developed by Eric Wolf, examines culture through the lens of production, labor, class relations, and exploitation. It focuses on how people produce goods, organize labor, and distribute resources within society. According to this approach, those who control the means of production can strongly influence social institutions and cultural life. Therefore, Marxist anthropology gives particular importance to class relations and economic power. Class struggle is viewed as an important force behind social change. In simple terms, changes in the way resources and economic power are controlled and distributed can lead to changes in society and culture. Conflict theory, represented in anthropology by Max Gluckman, views conflict as a normal part of social life. According to this approach, conflict does not necessarily destroy society. Instead, when conflict is managed through existing social mechanisms, it can actually strengthen social relationships. Conflict may also help to maintain social order, promote social adaptation, and contribute to social change. In this sense, conflict can have a constructive social function. So, rather than seeing conflict only as a source of disruption, Gluckman showed that it can also reveal tensions, restore relationships, and contribute to the stability and transformation of society. World systems and dependency theory, associated with Emmanuel Wallerstein and Sidney Mintz, examines the impact of global capitalism and colonialism. It focuses on the unequal relationships between powerful and weaker regions. These unequal relationships can create dependency, inequality, and uneven development. According to this perspective, local cultures and economies cannot be understood in isolation. Instead, they must be understood within wider global systems of power and economic relationships. In simple terms, what happens at the local level is often influenced by larger global economic and political forces.
Feminist anthropology, associated with scholars such as Sherry Ortner and Michelle Z. Rosaldo, examines gender inequality, patriarchy, and the cultural construction of gender. It challenges traditional, male-centered approaches in anthropology and brings greater attention to women's experiences, voices, and agency. Feminist anthropology also examines how gender shapes culture, identity, social relationships, and everyday social life. In simple terms, it asks how gender influences people's opportunities, experiences, and relationships within society. Thus, feminist anthropology helps us understand both gender inequality and the diverse ways in which people experience and negotiate gender in everyday life.
Practice theory focuses on how people actively create and reproduce social life through their everyday practices. It emphasizes that people are not simply controlled by social structures. They also have the ability to act, make choices, and influence social life. Anthony Giddens explains this through structuration theory. He shows how agency and social structure continuously influence one another. Pierre Bourdieu, on the other hand, developed the concepts of habitus, practice, and field to explain how social practices are shaped. Together, these approaches show that agency and structure interact continuously. Through everyday actions, people may reproduce existing social patterns, or they may transform and change society. In simple terms, society shapes what people do, but people also shape society through what they do every day.
Postmodern and reflexive anthropology is associated with scholars such as George Marcus and James Clifford. This perspective questions the idea that anthropological knowledge is completely objective. Instead, it emphasizes reflexivity, narrative, subjectivity, and co-produced knowledge. Reflexivity means that researchers recognize how their own background, position, and perspectives can influence the research process and its interpretation. At the same time, ethnographic knowledge is not seen as something produced by the researcher alone. It is shaped through interaction and dialogue with research participants. In simple terms, the anthropologist is not a completely detached observer. The knowledge produced through ethnography is influenced by the relationship between the researcher and the people being studied.
Globalization, transnationalism, and mobility is associated with scholars such as Arjun Appadurai and Ulf Hanners. This perspective emphasizes that culture is not confined within national boundaries. In today's interconnected world, people, ideas, media, technology, and capital move continuously across borders. These global flows influence the way people live, communicate, and understand their identities. As a result, culture becomes increasingly fluid, hybrid, and interconnected. Identities and social relationships are therefore not fixed. They are continuously shaped and transformed through global connections, mobility, and cross-cultural interaction.
Contemporary anthropological approaches include several important perspectives: decolonial anthropology, the ontological turn; posthumanism, actor network theory; critical medical anthropology, and intersectionality. These approaches challenge traditional and Eurocentric assumptions about culture, knowledge, and reality. Scholars, such as Martin Holbrad, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, Bruno Latour, and Meryl Singer, have contributed to these debates. They examine a wide range of contemporary issues, such as multiple realities, human-non-human relationships, inequality, health, power, and social justice. Together, these approaches expand anthropology beyond traditional boundaries and encourage us to think about whose knowledge counts, whose reality is recognized, and how humans, societies, and the wider world are interconnected.
Psychological or cognitive anthropology is associated with scholars such as Ward Goodenough, Roy DeAndrade, and Dan Sperber. This approach examines the relationship between culture and human cognition. It explores how culture influences the way people perceive the world, experience emotions, make decisions, and develop mental models and systems of knowledge. In other words, culture influences not only what people do, but also how they think and understand their world. This approach connects anthropology with cognitive science to understand how people think, interpret, learn, and make decisions within different cultural contexts.
So, these are the major theoretical perspectives of social cultural anthropology, tracing the development of anthropological thought from early evolutionary explanations to contemporary approaches. Each perspective provides a different way of understanding culture, society, power, meaning, environment, identity, and human behavior. Taken together, these perspectives show us how anthropology has continuously evolved, from explaining societies through broad theoretical models to understanding the complexity and diversity of human cultural life. And this is what makes social cultural anthropology a dynamic and ever evolving field of study.
Where there's human, there's anthropology. So keep exploring with Dr. Shuchi Srivastava, the anthropologist.